The scalpel never trembled in his hands. That's what Lorraine Warren would remember later. How steady those pale fingers remained as they peeled back the skin of a screaming woman strapped to a surgical table. The patient's eyes, wild with terror, locked onto Lorraine's, as if begging for intervention that would never come. "Help me. For God's sake, help me." But Lorraine couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even close her eyes as the doctor, tall and gaunt, with eyes like frozen ponds, methodically continued his work. The woman's face shifted, features rearranging until Lorraine gasped in horror. "Grandmother," Lorraine's fingers released the rosary beads, which clattered across the worn oak table in her Connecticut living room. The crucifix spun like a compass, needle before settling, pointing directly at her. "Lorraine." Ed's voice cut through the lingering tendrils of the vision. Her husband of 20 years stood in the doorway, his sturdy frame blocking the late afternoon light. "You all right, honey?" She wiped cold sweat from her brow. "Just a moment, I'm fine." Ed Warren knew better. After investigating hundreds of haunting together, he recognized the pallor of his wife's skin after a vision. He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "What did you see?" Before she could answer, the telephone rang shrill and insistent. 3 rings, then 4. Neither moved to answer it. "It was different this time," Lorraine whispered. "Not just images. I felt something reaching through, searching." The phone continued its persistent demand, and I think she hesitated, fingers trembling where Ed's couldn't see. "I think it just found me." Ed squeezed her hands once before releasing them to answer the phone. Lorraine watched his expression shift as he listened to the caller. His eyes found hers, concern deepening the lines around them. "Yes, Dr. Stewart. She's right here." He paused. "Blackwater Asylum? No, we're not familiar with it." Another pause. "I understand. We'll consider it." When he hung up, the silence between them felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. "They need our help at an asylum in Massachusetts," Ed said carefully. "Violent manifestations, a suicide." Lorraine nodded, retrieving the fallen rosary. The silver beads were ice cold against her skin. "I know," she said simply. "He's been waiting for us." "Out of the question." Ed paced their small kitchen, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "We just finished the Perrin case. You're still recovering." Lorraine sat at the kitchen table, her tea untouched. Through the window, dusk painted the October sky, in bruised purples and angry reds. "This is different, Ed." "Different how?" Another desperate call. Another troubled place. He turned to face her. "Another risk to you." The kitchen radio crackled with static, though neither had turned it on. A distant voice murmured unintelligibly before falling silent. "Dr. Stewart is coming at 7, Lorraine said quietly. "I already called him back." Ed's shoulders slumped in defeat. After 20 years of marriage, he recognized the quiet certainty in her voice. Whatever Lorraine had seen in her vision, it had already set them on this path. "Tell me what you saw." He sat across from her, all of it. She described the doctor, the surgical theater, the patient with her grandmother's face. As she spoke, the light bulb above them flickered erratically. "Your grandmother was institutionalized briefly in the 20s, wasn't she?" Ed asked. "Depression after your mother was born?" "Yes, but she never spoke about it. Not once." Lorraine wrapped her fingers around the cold teacup. "I only know because my mother told me after the funeral." The doorbell rang precisely at 7. Dr. Marcus Stewart stood on their porch, a leather briefcase clutched in one hand. He was younger than Lorraine had expected, early 40s perhaps, with prematurely silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the porch light. "Mr. and Mrs. Warren," he said with practiced professionalism, "thank you for seeing me on such short notice." In their study, surrounded by artifacts from previous cases, blessed crucifixes, spirit photography, a Ouija board sealed in glass, Stewart opened his briefcase. Blackwater Asylum was founded in 1891 by Dr. Elias Blackwater, he explained, spreading photographs across the table. It was revolutionary for its time, a place where mental illness was treated as a medical condition rather than moral failing. The photographs showed a massive Gothic structure perched on a hilltop, all sharp angles and forbidding spires. Newer wings sprouted from the original building like architectural afterthoughts. "I've been director for 8 years, Stewart continued. "Until recently, the most troubled part of our history was in the distant past. But 3 months ago, we reopened the East Wing for renovation. That's when it started." "What exactly is it?" Ed asked, studying the photos. Staff reports shadow. Figures following them through corridors. Voices from empty rooms. Equipment malfunctions. Patient restraints unfastening themselves. Stewart removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Last month, Nurse Patricia Klein committed suicide by jumping from the roof. She left a note saying only, 'They made me do it.'" Lorraine's voice was barely audible. 2 orderlies have since resigned. A patient was found with surgical markings on her skin, perfect incision patterns that appeared overnight. Number, bleeding, no sign of actual cutting, just marks. Stewart's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "I've worked in psychiatric medicine for 20 years. I don't scare easily, but what's happening at it's beyond explanation." "Where was the East Wing?" Lorraine asked suddenly. Stewart seemed startled by the question. "The easternmost part of the property. Why and when was it closed?" 1926. After a fire. Lorraine and Ed exchanged a look. 1926, the year her grandmother was released. "Dr. Stewart," Lorraine said carefully, "was there ever a patient named Margaret Sullivan at?" "In the early 20s, Stewart frowned. "I couldn't say offhand. The older records aren't fully indexed." "Why do you ask?" "She was my grandmother." The room seemed to grow colder. Outside, a branch scraped against the window like fingernails seeking entrance. "Mrs. Warren, are you saying you have a personal connection too?" Stewart leaned forward. "I'm saying something that has a connection to me." Lorraine stood. "We'll need to leave first thing tomorrow." Ed started to protest but fell silent when she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever is waiting there," she said, "it's been patient for a very long time, but I don't think it will wait much longer." Later that night, as Ed packed their investigation equipment, Lorraine stood at their bedroom window. In the rippled glass, she caught a reflection that wasn't her own, a gaunt face with clinical, assessing eyes. "Come home," a voice whispered from nowhere and everywhere. For the first time in her life, Lorraine's gift terrified her. Asylum emerged from the morning mist like a monument to despair. The late October sun struggled to penetrate the gloom surrounding the facility, its rays fracturing against Gothic spires and barred windows. "Jesus," Ed muttered as their car followed the winding drive toward the main entrance. "Who builds a place like this and expects people to get better?" Lorraine didn't answer. Since crossing the property line, a pressure had been building behind. Her eyes like the sensation before a migraine, but deeper, more invasive. Something reaching inside her, tasting her thoughts. "Welcome back. We've been waiting." The entrance hall's grandeur had faded over decades of institutional use. Marble floors were dulled by industrial cleaners, ornate woodwork painted over with institutional beige. Yet hints of its former elegance remained in the sweeping staircase, and stained glass lunettes that cast colored shadows across the worn floor. Dr. Stewart performed introductions with efficient haste. "This is head nurse Collins, who oversees our staff." Collins was a severe woman in her 50s, iron grey hair pulled into a tight bun. Her handshake was brief, her smile perfunctory. "The East Wing is prepped for your investigation." The word carried clear skepticism. "Jenkins has been with us 20 years. He'll assist with anything you need." The orderly nodded nervously, eyes darting toward the corridor that presumably led to the East Wing. "Been hearing things over there since they took down the wall. Nothing good stirs up when you disturb old places." "And Dr. Harrison, who joined us last month." Harrison was younger, early 30s, with an earnest face and modern ideas practically radiating from him. "I've followed your work, Mrs. Warren. The intersection of belief systems and psychological manifestations is fascinating." "That's one word for it," Ed said dryly, setting down their equipment cases. "We'll start with a tour," Stewart said. "I want you to understand what we're dealing with." As they walked, Stewart narrated the asylum's history. Blackwater was built on the site of the old town gallows. 19 executions before they were relocated in 1880. Dr. Blackwater purchased the land because it was cheap, but some say he had other reasons. They paused at a heavy door marked hydrotherapy. "Treatment methods were different then," Stewart said, unlocking it. "What we'd consider barbaric was standard practice." The room contained massive cast iron tubs with restraint systems and rusted pipes overhead. The air felt dense, oppressive. Water treatments were considered therapeutic, Harrison explained. Ice baths for mania, steam for melancholia, and drowning for disobedience. Lorraine asked quietly, her fingers trailing along the edge of a tub. In her mind's eye, she saw a woman held underwater, screaming bubbles toward the surface. A deafening crack interrupted her vision. One of the overhead pipes split open, spraying rust-colored water that scattered across the tiled floor. Ed jumped back, but Lorraine stood transfixed as the water pooled, then inexplicably rose, forming the vague shape of a human figure before her. For one impossible moment, it held its form, reaching a liquid hand toward her face. Then it collapsed, splashing back to the floor. "Damn infrastructure," Collins muttered, already moving to shut off the valve. "These pipes have been failing for years." "Did you see that?" Ed whispered to Lorraine. The water moved against gravity. She nodded slightly, wiping a rust-colored droplet from her cheek. Harrison frowned at the water. "That's strange. These pipes were supposedly drained decades ago when the hydrotherapy program ended." "We should continue," Stewart said, visibly disturbed. "There's more to see before you set up your equipment." As they walked down the central corridor, Lorraine felt a tugging sensation, like a child pulling at her sleeve for attention. She turned toward an unmarked door. "What's in there?" she asked. Stewart hesitated. "That leads to the old surgical theater." Dr. Blackwater was known for experimental treatments, some quite controversial. "I need to see it," Lorraine said, her voice distant even to her own ears. The moment she crossed the threshold, the vision slammed into her with physical force. A patient strapped to a table, surgical tools arranged with loving precision, the steady hands of a doctor making careful incisions while whispering. The mind is merely the beginning. The soul is where the true work lies. Lorraine, Ed's voice pulled her back as her knees buckled. I'm all right, she managed, though they both knew it was a lie. But something terrible happened here, and it's not finished. Stuart's expression darkened. That's exactly what Nurse Klein said. The week before she jumped, this will be your base of operations. Stuart unlocked double doors leading to what had once been a day room. Dust sheets covered abandoned furniture, and windows were partially boarded, creating bars of light across the floor. The east wing has been sealed since 1926. Until 3 months ago, Ed noted, setting down their equipment cases. Yes, the hospital board finally approved renovation. Stuart gestured to the modern circuit breakers on one wall. We've restored electricity, but otherwise left it untouched. Why was it closed? Lorraine asked, running her fingers along a dust-covered credenza. Stuart hesitated. A fire. Though the damage was surprisingly minimal, some said Dr. Blackwater himself ordered it sealed after he stopped. After what? Ed pressed. After a series of unexplained deaths, both patients and staff. Stuart checked his watch. I have rounds, but Jenkins will help you set up. Collins wants nothing to do with this wing, but she's assigned an orderly to each floor in case you need assistance. After Stuart left, Ed began unpacking their equipment. Thermographic cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, recording devices. What did you feel in that surgery room? He asked quietly. Lorraine stared out a window overlooking the asylum grounds. Pain, purpose, pride. She turned to him. Whoever worked there wasn't just treating patients, Ed. He was searching for something. Something worth killing for. Before she could answer, a soft knock interrupted them. Jenkins stood in the doorway with a young woman in hospital whites. Her eyes were downcast, arms wrapped tightly around a sketchbook. This is Hannah, Jenkins said gently. Dr. Stewart thought you might want to meet her. She's been sensitive to what's happening. Hannah looked about 20, with lank blonde hair and a perpetual tremor in her hands. She clutched her sketchbook, like a shield. Hello, Hannah, Lorraine said, approaching slowly. I'm Lorraine Warren. This is my husband, Ed. The girl's eyes darted up briefly. You're here about the doctor. What doctor, Hannah? Ed asked. Hannah flipped open her sketchbook, revealing dozens of charcoal drawings all of the same figure. A tall, thin man in Victorian surgical attire. His face was mostly shadow, but his hands were drawn with unsettling precision. In many drawings, those hands held surgical tools or were deep inside opened bodies. He visits at night, Hannah whispered. Examining, always examining. Lorraine gently took the sketchbook, flipping through the pages. The drawings became more detailed toward the end, showing a gaunt face with penetrating eyes. Has he spoken to you? Lorraine asked. Hannah nodded. He says I'm special, that I can help him come back. Her eyes suddenly fixed on Lorraine with surprising clarity. He's been waiting for you to come back. Come back, Ed stepped forward. Lorraine's never been here before, not her. Hannah's finger traced the air in front of Lorraine's face. What's inside her? He says it belongs to him. Jenkins cleared his throat uncomfortably. I should get Hannah back to her ward. Dr. Harrison doesn't like her visiting this wing. After they left, Ed and Lorraine exchanged troubled looks. I'm going to check the other rooms, Ed said. Stay here with the equipment. Alone, Lorraine closed her eyes, extending her psychic sensitivity outward. The asylum seemed to pulse around her like a living organism. Whispers filtered through walls. Footsteps overhead where no one walked. and beneath it all, a steady anticipation, like a heartbeat gradually accelerating. In an adjacent room, Ed discovered a bookcase that didn't quite fit against the wall. Pushing experimentally, he felt it give slightly. With more pressure, the entire unit swung inward, revealing a hidden office. Dust-covered journals filled shelves, patient files spilled from ancient cabinets. Among them, one folder lay open on a desk, as if recently examined. The name on the tab froze Ed's blood. Sullivan, Margaret, Lorraine's grandmother. The file contained clinical notes, brain diagrams, and observations. Subject exhibits exceptional psychic sensitivity. Ideal candidate for continuation. Bloodline must be preserved and monitored. A notation on the final page read, "Escaped before final procedure. Unacceptable loss. Will require recovery of subject or direct descendant to complete work." As darkness fell over Blackwater Asylum, the first recordings captured a whispered voice that would chill them when played back later. "The Warren woman carries what we need. Prepare the theater. The work continues tonight." Outside the sealed east wing, Hannah pressed her forehead against the cold wall, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I told him you were here. I had to. He'll hurt me if I don't help him." In the darkness behind her, a tall shadow moved independently of any light source. Dawn crawled reluctantly over Blackwater Asylum, grey light seeping through boarded windows like watered-down blood. Ed and Lorraine had slept fitfully in their makeshift command center, surrounded by equipment that had recorded disturbances all night. Temperature drops to near freezing, electromagnetic spikes that fried to sensors, and audio recordings filled with whispers too faint to decipher. "We need to know more about Blackwater," Ed said over bitter coffee from a thermos. "The doctor Hannah drew, the connection to your grandmother, none of it makes sense yet." Stewart mentioned town archives, Lorraine replied, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. The night had left her drained in ways she couldn't articulate, as if something had been siphoning her energy while she dreamed. The Millfield Historical Society occupied a former church near the town square. The archivist, a retired history teacher named Gladys Winters, perked up at their mention of Blackwater. "Oh, Dr. Blackwater. He's something of a local legend." She disappeared into the stacks, returning with dusty boxes. "Brilliant man, they say. Ahead of his time though, whether that was good or bad depends on who you ask." Photographs showed a tall, gaunt man with intense eyes beneath a prominent brow identical to Hannah's drawings. Newspaper clippings chronicled his rise from obscure researcher to asylum director. Medical journals published his theories on treating mental illness through what he called transcendental interventions. He believed mental disorders weren't just chemical or psychological, Gladys explained, but spiritual in nature. That the barrier between mind and soul was permeable. "Did he have success with his treatments?" Lorraine asked. Gladys's expression darkened. "Depends on how you define success. Patient fatalities were high, but survivors often showed remarkable changes." "Changes," Ed pressed. "Heightened sensitivities, abilities that bordered on supernatural, according to some accounts." She lowered her voice. "There were rumors of patients who could predict future events, move objects without touching them, even communicate with the deceased." Lorraine felt a chill pass through her. "When did Dr. Blackwater die?" "That's the curious thing," Gladys said, pulling out a final folder. October 31st, 1926, the same day the East Wing was sealed. Back at the asylum, they found a former nurse who'd worked at Blackwater since the 1940s. Martha Jennings, now elderly and frail, agreed to speak with them in the asylum's garden. "I never worked in the East Wing," she said, arthritic fingers plucking at her cardigan. "Nobody did after 26. But the stories, they followed us like shadows." "What kind of stories?" Lorraine asked gently. "Staff suicides. Always around Halloween. Always from the same window in the East Tower." Martha's eyes grew distant. "They'd report seeing Dr. Blackwater in dreams first. Then, while awake, then they'd say he was asking them to help with his great work. Within days, they'd be gone." Ed showed her the photo of Dr. Blackwater. "Is this him?" Martha nodded. "I only saw him once myself, standing at the end of the third-floor corridor. But when I approached, he wasn't there," Lorraine finished. "No, but on the wall where he'd been standing, there was a surgical diagram drawn in what looked like blood. A perfect rendering of the human brain with certain areas marked for 'she swallowed' for extraction." That evening, reviewing the hospital's death records, Ed discovered the pattern. Every 7 years, like clockwork, 3 or 4 unexplained deaths among staff, all in October, all with connections to the East Wing. 1926, 1933, 1940. Lorraine calculated forward. If the pattern holds, we're in a death year. As darkness fell again, Lorraine prepared for bed in their makeshift quarters. In the small bathroom attached to their base room, she splashed water on her face, trying to wash away the day's revelations. When she looked up, her reflection showed dark circles beneath eyes that seemed unnaturally bright. Something on her collarbone caught her attention. A small mark, red and precise, like a surgeon's preliminary notation. Heart racing, she unbuttoned her blouse to find more marks across her chest and abdomen, surgical guidelines, dotted incision. Lines, anatomical notations in a language she didn't recognize. "Ed," she called, her voice breaking. He rushed in, eyes widening at the marks. "When did this happen? I don't know. They weren't there this morning." She traced one line that ran from her sternum to navel. "It doesn't hurt. It's like they're just showing what they're planning to do." Ed photographed each mark before they faded like disappearing ink, gone within an hour. The camera caught what their eyes could in tiny script alongside each marking. When enlarged, they matched handwritten notes in Blackwater's journals: psychic, nexus, extraction point, resonance chamber. Dr. Stewart found them reviewing the photos in their command center. "I came as soon as I got your message," he said, face pale in the harsh light. "Those markings there, similar to what we found on Nurse Klein before she jumped." "What exactly are you trying to do here, Dr. Stewart?" Ed demanded. "You said you were renovating the East Wing, but why open it at all after so many deaths?" Stewart sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "I'm trying to save this place, Mr. Warren. Blackwater Asylum has a terrible reputation, deserved or not. I thought by reclaiming the East Wing, modernizing it, we could finally move beyond the past." "Or you wanted to see if the rumors were true," Lorraine said quietly, "about Dr. Blackwater's success with unusual patients." Stewart hesitated, then nodded slightly. His early work before the controversial experiments was revolutionary. He understood certain mental conditions weren't illnesses, but different states of consciousness. His theories about treating schizophrenia are being validated by modern research. And the rest, Ed pressed. The experiments, the deaths. "Science often advances through trial and error," Stewart said carefully. "I don't condone his methods. But if we could separate the valuable insights from the ethical violations, you're playing with fire, Lorraine warned. Perhaps. Stuart looked directly at her. But wouldn't you want to understand why your grandmother was chosen? Why you have your abilities? Blackwater was searching for something. What if he found it? After Stuart left, Ed turned to Lorraine. He knows more than he's telling us. Yes, she agreed, but so does this place. And tonight, I think we need to listen. The overnight audio recordings yielded results by morning. Filtering out background noise, they heard a single phrase repeated in different voices. The Warren woman carries what we need. They're talking about you, Ed said, face drawn with concern. Whatever Blackwater was doing, whatever connection, your grandmother had it's about your abilities. We need to speak with Hannah again, Lorraine decided. She seems to communicate with whatever is here. But upon arriving at the patient ward, they found chaos. A male patient was being restrained by 4 orderlies, his body contorting unnaturally as he screamed in a voice too deep to be his own. The work continues. The extraction approaches. Prepare the vessels. Dr. Harrison administered a sedative, and gradually the man went limp. As they carried him to isolation, Harrison approached the Warrens. "Third one this morning," he said grimly. "It's spreading through the ward like contagion. They're all saying the same things about work, extraction, vessels." "Where's Hannah?" Lorraine asked. "Art therapy with Nurse Collins. This way." They found Hannah alone in the art room, surrounded by dozens of new drawings, all variations of surgical procedures being performed on a woman with Loren's face. "He's excited you're here," Hannah said, without looking up, her hand moving across. "The paper with mechanical precision says you're the perfect subject, better than the others, better than me." "Who is he, Hannah?" Lorraine asked gently, sitting beside her. "The doctor. He built this place to find people like us. Special minds, receptive souls." Her hand never stopped drawing. "But you're different. You have something he needs." Ed examined the room's walls, covered in Hannah's previous artwork. Among anatomical drawings and portraits of Dr. Blackwater, he noticed a recurring symbol, a circular design with intricate patterns. "What's this symbol, Hannah?" "The map," she whispered, "to the other side." While Ed photographed the drawings, Lorraine felt increasingly uneasy. The air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. Objects in her peripheral vision appeared to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The building itself felt aware of her presence. "I need some air," she said suddenly. Outside, Lorraine followed an overgrown path behind the asylum. Ancient oak trees formed a natural barrier around a section of the grounds overcome by weeds and brambles. Something tugged at her awareness, a chorus of whispers just beyond hearing. Pushing through the undergrowth, she discovered a forgotten cemetery. Dozens of unmarked stones, weathered by decades of neglect, stood in uneven rows. No names, only numbers. "Patient graves," said a voice behind her. Lorraine turned to find Nurse Collins watching from the path. "Those deemed unfit for Christian burial," Collins continued, her usual skepticism absent. "The unsuccessful experiments, the inconvenient witnesses." "You know about Blackwater's work," Lorraine said. "Not a question." "My grandmother worked here as a nurse, under him." Collins stepped closer, examining the graves. She kept journals, things she wasn't supposed to see, procedures that never made it into official records. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're marked." Collins's eyes flicked to Lorraine's collarbone. where the first surgical notation had appeared. Just like my grandmother was. Just like all the others. Every 7 years, someone with your sensitivity is drawn here. Usually staff. Sometimes patients. They start seeing him. Then come the markings. Then they help him before they die. Collins's clinical detachment faltered. I thought it was superstition until Nurse Klein. The markings appeared on her 3 days before she jumped. What was Blackwater trying to do? Lorraine asked. Create a doorway, Collins said simply, between life and death, mind and spirit. He believed certain people could serve as conduits, living bridges between worlds. Back inside, Ed was alone in the East Wing, reviewing audio from the previous night. The headphones isolated him from the ambient sounds of the asylum, focusing his attention on the electronic hiss of the recording. Prepare the theater, a voice whispered. The Warren woman is ready for preliminary examination. The temperature in the room plummeted. His breath fogged before him as the recorder continued playing, now capturing sounds that hadn't been there moments before. Metallic clinks, glass vials clinking together, the squeak of a rolling cart. The voice from the recorder spoke again, this time in real time. Physician, heal thyself. Ed spun around. The room remained empty, but the walls had changed. Medical diagrams now covered the previously blank surfaces. Anatomical drawings of the human brain with specific regions highlighted in red. On the central table, surgical instruments had arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle: scalpels, bone saws, retractors, each positioned with clinical precision. He reached for the door, but it slammed shut. The instruments rose in unison, hovering momentarily before flying toward him. Ed dove beneath the table as scalpels embedded themselves in the wall where he'd been standing. Show yourself, he shouted, whatever you are. An excellent suggestion, the voice replied. An invisible force grabbed Ed's ankles, dragging him across the floor toward an antique examination chair that hadn't been there minutes before. Leather straps uncoiled like serpents, wrapping around his wrists and ankles as he struggled. The husband requires a demonstration, the voice continued, to understand what his wife will experience. A scalpel lifted from the floor, hovering before Ed's face. It traced a line without cutting from his forehead to his throat. The mind is housed in the brain, but the soul resides throughout the body, the voice lectured. To extract it properly requires precision. Your wife possesses the ideal configuration, a perfect resonance chamber. The scalpel pressed against Ed's temple, breaking the skin. A trickle of blood ran down his face as he fought against the restraints. Suddenly, the door burst open. Lorraine stood in the threshold, her eyes blazing with an intensity Ed had never seen before. Stop, she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to ripple through the air. The instruments clattered to the floor. The restraints loosened enough for Ed to wrench free. The presence retreated, but not before whispering directly into Lorraine's mind. You command power you don't understand, power that belongs to me, by blood right. As Ed staggered to Lorraine's side, she caught him, feeling the wound on his temple. How did you know? He gasped. I felt you, she said simply. Your pain called to me from across the asylum. Something's happening to me here, Ed. My abilities, they're intensifying. Later, after bandaging Ed's wound, they compared notes on their discoveries, the cemetery, Collins's revelation, the attack. We need to identify the entity first, Ed said, pacing despite his lingering dizziness. Confirm its Blackwater spirit before attempting any kind of confrontation. There's only one way to know for sure, Lorraine said quietly. We need to make direct contact. Ed stared at her. Here, after what just happened, where? Running out of time, she insisted. The anniversary of Blackwater's death is tomorrow night. If the pattern holds, that's when whatever he's planning will happen. We need answers now. Ed recognized the determination in her eyes, the same look she'd had before every major case they'd faced together. He squeezed her hand. We do it together, he said, and at the first sign of danger, we shut it down. Outside their door, Hannah stood listening, tears streaming down her face. Behind her, the tall shadow of Dr. Blackwater nodded in silent approval. I did what you asked, she whispered to the presence. They're going to try to reach you. Excellent, the shadow replied, placing incorporeal hands on her shoulders. Now the real work can begin. They prepared thee in the old surgical theatre, the epicenter of Blackwater's work, according to the architectural plans Stuart had reluctantly provided. Candles marked the cardinal points. A recording device sat at the center of their circle, which included Ed, Lorraine, and at Lorraine's insistence, Hannah. She's connected to whatever's here, Lorraine had explained. She might be the key to controlling the communication. Jenkins stood watch outside the door, clutching a crucifix Ed had given him. Dr. Stewart had wanted to observe, but Ed refused trust in the asylum director had eroded with each new revelation. Remember, Ed warned as they joined hands, we're only making contact to identify the entity and its intentions. No agreements, no permissions, no invitations of any kind. Lorraine nodded, then closed her eyes. We seek to communicate with the spirit present in this asylum. We mean no disrespect nor disturbance. We ask only for clarity and truth. The candles flickered simultaneously, though the air remained still. The temperature dropped sharply, enough that their breath became visible. Are you the spirit of Dr. Elias Blackwater? Lorraine asked. The recording device emitted a burst of static, followed by a cultured voice with the crisp diction of another era. I am he, and you, Lorraine Warren, are finally where you belong. What do you want from this place, from the people here? Continuation, completion, transcendence. Each word came from a different point in the room, as if the presence was circling. Then, my work was interrupted. The final integration remained incomplete. Integration of what? Ed demanded. Mind and spirit, life and afterlife. I discovered the threshold between worlds, but to cross it required a vessel of particular resonance, a mind capable of containing consciousness beyond death. Hannah's hand trembled violently in Lorraine's grip. He wants to come back, she whispered. Through you, the temperature plummeted further. Frost crystallized on the walls in intricate surgical patterns. Why me? Lorraine asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. A chuckle resonated through the room. Blood calls to blood, Mrs. Warren. Your grandmother was promising, but escaped before completion. Her bloodline carries the potential a genetic predisposition to psychic resonance. But you've developed that potential beyond my expectations. My abilities are my own, Lorraine insisted, not yours to claim or use. Your abilities exist because of me. The voice thundered, rattling instruments on the walls. I cultivated that bloodline for generations. Your gift is my legacy. A wind that couldn't exist in the sealed room extinguished the candles, plunging them into darkness. In the blackness, Ed felt Hannah's hand torn from the circle. Her scream pierced the darkness before cutting off abruptly. Hannah. Lorraine broke the circle, fumbling for her flashlight. The beam revealed Hannah standing rigidly beside an antique operating table that hadn't been there before. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only whites, and when she spoke, it was with Blackwater's voice. "Shall I demonstrate what awaits you, Mrs. Warren? This vessel is limited but serviceable for basic procedures." Hannah's hands moved with mechanical precision, mimicking surgical gestures in the air. The human mind generates measurable energy, electrical, chemical, spiritual. This energy can be extracted, contained, transferred. I perfected the process in 1926, but lacked the ideal vessel to complete the final integration. "Let her go," Ed demanded, stepping forward. The husband defends his wife. Admirable, but futile. Hannah's body turned toward Lorraine. "Your psychic abilities make you the perfect resonance chamber. Your connection to the spirit world is the doorway I need. Together, we could bridge the final gap between life and death." "I will never help you," Lorraine said. "You already are." Hannah's finger pointed to Lorraine's chest, where the surgical markings had reappeared, now glowing faintly beneath her blouse. "Every moment in this asylum strengthens our connection. Your power feeds mine. Soon, no permission will be necessary." Hannah's body convulsed violently, then collapsed. Ed rushed to her side while Lorraine remained frozen, feeling the presence of Blackwater now coalescing around her like a shroud. "Tomorrow night," the voice whispered, now directly in her ear. "When the veil thins on the anniversary of my physical death, the transference will occur. Your consciousness will make room for mine. A perfect integration." The presence retreated, leaving the room suddenly, unnaturally silent. Hannah stirred in Ed's arms, her eyes fluttering open. "He was inside me," she whispered, horrified. "I felt everything, his thoughts, his hunger." Jenkins burst through the door. "What happened?" The entire asylum felt its power fluctuations, doors slamming, patients screaming in unison. Before they could answer, Dr. Stewart appeared behind him, face ashen. "My office now. There's something you need to see." Stewart's office in the main wing was meticulously organized except for his desk, which was covered with ancient folders, medical journals, and personal correspondence. He locked the door behind them. "I haven't been entirely forthcoming," he began, voice strained. "My connection to Blackwater is more direct than I implied." He handed Ed a yellowed photograph showing a group of doctors in early 20th century attire. Dr. Blackwater stood at the center, imposing even then. Beside him, a younger doctor whose features unmistakably resembled Stewart. "Your grandfather," Lorraine realized. Stewart nodded. "Blackwater's protege and eventual successor. He assisted with the experimental procedures, all of them. After Blackwater died and the East Wing was sealed, my grandfather continued researching his theories in secret." "You knew about the hauntings all along," Ed accused. "You opened the East Wing deliberately." "I knew the stories," Stewart admitted. "I didn't believe them until things started happening. But yes, I wanted to see if there was truth to my grandfather's journals, his claims about Blackwater's breakthroughs in treating mental illness through what he called consciousness integration." "He wasn't treating anyone," Lorraine said coldly. "He was experimenting on vulnerable people to find a way to cheat death." "It wasn't that simple," Stewart insisted, unlocking a cabinet behind his desk. "Blackwater believed mental illness was caused by fragmentation of consciousness. His early work genuinely helped patients by reintegrating dissociated parts of their minds. But then he became obsessed with extending the technique, integrating consciousness across the threshold of death. He withdrew a key far older than the others. wrought iron with an intricate design matching the symbol from Hannah's drawings. There's more you need to see. A place my grandfather showed me before he died. He made me swear never to open it, unless absolutely necessary. Stuart's hand trembled slightly. I think that time has come. The key opened a door in the asylum's subbasement, a section absent from official blueprints. Stuart led them through narrow corridors that predated the main, building stonework reminiscent of catacombs rather than a medical facility. Their flashlight beams caught movement at the periphery, darting shadows that vanished when viewed directly. My grandfather said Blackwater chose this location specifically, Stuart explained as they descended another staircase. The original structure was built in the 1700s as a sanitarium for those believed possessed. Blackwater theorized certain locations formed natural conduits to the spiritual plane. The air grew heavier, charged with the metallic scent of ozone. Lorraine felt pressure building in her skull, thousands of whispers just beyond comprehension, pressing against her consciousness like hands against a thin membrane. How much further? Ed asked, noticing Lorraine's increasing distress. We're here. Stuart stopped before a massive iron door inscribed with the same circular symbol from Hannah's drawings. Blackwater called this his laboratory of transcendence. According to my grandfather, no one has entered since October 31st, 1926. The lock mechanism was complex, multiple tumblers that required the key to be turned in a specific pattern. As Stuart manipulated it, Lorraine placed her palm against the door. A shock of recognition jolted through her. This place knew her, had been waiting for her. The door swung open with surprising silence, revealing a chamber that defied time. No dust covered the surfaces. No rust had formed on the metal instruments. The air, though stale, felt electrically alive. Blackwater's laboratory was a disturbing fusion of operating theater, scientific laboratory, and occult temple. Surgical tables arranged in a perfect circle surrounded a central platform raised slightly above the floor. Anatomical diagrams covered the walls, interspersed with mystical symbols and mathematical equations. Glass cabinets held specimens in preservation fluid brain tissue, spinal columns, and other organs Lorraine couldn't identify. My God, Ed breathed, training his flashlight across the room. This isn't medical research. This is something else, entirely. Stuart approached a large journal on a pedestal near the central platform. Blackwater's final research journal. My grandfather spoke of it, but even he never read the complete text. Lorraine was drawn to the central platform. Standing upon it, she felt a resonance like striking a tuning fork that matched her exact frequency. The surgical markings on her skin began to glow faintly, corresponding to symbols etched into the platform's surface. Lorraine, Ed warned, seeing the illumination beneath her blouse. It's all right, she said, though uncertainty colored her voice. I need to understand what he was doing here. Stuart carefully opened the journal. According to my grandfather, Blackwater's early work focused on treating dissociative disorders by helping patients reintegrate fragmented aspects of consciousness. His success rates were unprecedented, but he didn't stop there, Ed guessed. No, he became convinced that consciousness wasn't confined to the physical brain, that it existed in what he called a spectrum of resonance, extending beyond physical death. Stuart turned pages covered in diagrams and dense text. He believed certain individuals could perceive this spectrum: psychics, mediums, sensitives. More importantly, he theorized these individuals could be modified to serve as conduits. Conduits? For what? Lorraine asked. though she already suspected the answer. For consciousness transfer. Stuart looked up from the journal. Blackwater wasn't experimenting on mental patients out of cruelty. He was searching for compatible vessels' minds with the correct psychic resonance to house consciousness beyond death, his consciousness. The implication settled over them like a shroud. He was creating a way to possess someone permanently, Ed said, to steal their body after his death. He called it integration, not possession, Stuart corrected. He believed the host's consciousness would remain, merged with his owner's symbiotic relationship that would benefit both. That's not what the spirits of his victims say, Lorraine countered. Stuart turned to a final section of the journal. According to this, Blackwater identified your grandmother as the ideal candidate, a perfect resonance chamber, with naturally occurring psychic abilities that could be amplified through surgical modification. But she escaped, Ed noted. Yes, the night before his planned integration procedure. Blackwater was furious. Stuart pointed to frantic handwriting on the final pages. He describes how he'd spent decades cultivating bloodlines with potential, including your grandmother's family. He believed psychic sensitivity could be engineered genetically over generations. He created psychics through selective breeding, Lorraine said, horror dawning. Like livestock. Worse, Stuart admitted. According to my grandfather, when your grandmother escaped, Blackwater attempted the integration procedure on a less suitable subject. Something went catastrophically wrong. The fire in 1926, Ed surmised. Not exactly a fire. Stuart closed the journal. My grandfather described it as a rupture in the veil, a tear between worlds that killed Blackwater and 5 assistants. Instantly, their bodies remained but showed no physical trauma, as if their consciousness had been extracted. And now he's trying again, Lorraine said. With me. A sudden realization struck Ed. The patient's experiencing violent episodes. Speaking with Blackwater's voice, they're not just being influenced by his spirit. He's been practicing integration, testing compatibility, but none have been suitable. Stuart nodded grimly. Until you arrived. Why tell us this now? Ed demanded. Why keep it secret until we're already in danger? Stuart's expression shifted from scientific detachment to genuine remorse. Because I wanted to believe my grandfather was right, that Blackwater's work, despite its ethical compromises, could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, that mental illness could be cured through his methods. You reopened the East Wing deliberately, Lorraine accused, to see if Blackwater's spirit would manifest. Yes, Stuart admitted. But I never intended. He stopped as the laboratory door slammed shut behind them. The electric lamps that had remained dormant for decades suddenly illuminated, bathing the room in harsh light. The surgical instruments began to vibrate in their cases. The preservation fluid in specimen jars bubbled as if suddenly heated. On the central platform where Lorraine stood, the floor began to glow with the same circular symbol from Hannah's drawings. Lorraine tried to step away but found herself frozen in place, an invisible force holding her at the center of the pattern. Ed, she cried, reaching for him. Before he could reach her, the wall behind the platform split open, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside, suspended in a glass case filled with amber fluid, hung a human heart perfectly preserved, still faintly pulsing with unnatural life. His heart, Stuart whispered in horrified recognition. My grandfather said Blackwater preserved his own heart as an anchor for his consciousness, but I thought it was metaphorical. The heart's pulse quickened as Blackwater's voice filled. The laboratory, the vessel has arrived. The bloodline has matured. Tomorrow night, when the veil thins on the anniversary of my transition, the final integration will commence. Lorraine felt her consciousness being invaded like fingers probing her mind, testing barriers, searching for vulnerabilities. The surgical markings on her skin burned white, hot as Blackwater's spirit attempted partial integration. With supreme effort, she pushed back, forcing the invading presence out of her mind. The connection broke with a psychic backlash that shattered glass. Throughout the laboratory and through Ed and Stuart against the walls. Freed from the platform, Lorraine rushed to Ed's side. "We need to leave. Now." As they fled the laboratory, Blackwater's laughter followed them through the corridors. "Run if you must. It changes nothing. Blood calls to blood, and you carry what I need." Back in their command center, Lorraine collapsed, exhausted from the mental battle. "He's stronger than any entity we've faced," she told Ed. "And he knows me, knows how my abilities work. It's like he has a map to my mind. Because he helped create it," Ed said grimly. "Through your grandmother's bloodline." Stuart, who had followed them, looked shaken to his core. "I've made a terrible mistake. I thought I was continuing legitimate research. I never imagined that your grandfather helped create a monster who's been planning his resurrection for a century." Ed finished bitterly. Hannah appeared in their doorway, her face pale but composed. "He's shown me everything now," she said quietly. "What he did, what he's planning. You've been communicating with him all along," Lorraine realized. "I didn't have a choice at first." Hannah entered the room, sitting on the edge of a chair. "He found me when I was admitted 3 years ago. Said my mind was receptive. He's been preparing me as a backup vessel in case I proved difficult," Lorraine finished. Hannah nodded. "But I'm not strong enough. My mind would burn out within days of integration. He needs Yaya-specific neurological structure, your psychic abilities, your bloodline connection." "When is he planning to attempt this integration?" Ed asked. "Tomorrow night, Halloween, the anniversary of his death, when the boundary between worlds is thinnest." Hannah's hands trembled slightly. "He's been gathering power for years, storing it in his preserved heart. Tomorrow night, he'll have enough energy to force a complete integration with or without your cooperation." Stuart leaned against the wall, the weight of his complicity evident in his posture. "What can we do to stop him?" "We need to find the binding point," Ed said, years of demonological research surfacing. "The heart is his anchor to this plane." "If we can destroy it, it won't be that simple," Lorraine interrupted. "The heart is protected by whatever ritual he used to preserve it. I felt it when I was on that platform, layers of spiritual barriers." "There's something else," Hannah said hesitantly. "Something he tried to hide from me, but I glimpsed it in his memories. A journal, not the research journal, but a personal diary. It contains the original binding ritual. If we could find it, we could reverse it," Ed finished. "Where would it be?" "I don't know exactly, but it would be somewhere personal to him. Somewhere safe." Hannah closed her eyes, concentrating. "He keeps thinking about a room with a view of the cemetery. Eastern exposure, morning light. The director's residence," Stuart realized. "The old house adjacent to the asylum. Blackwater lived there during his tenure. It's been sealed since the 1940s, but as director, I have the keys." Ed checked his watch. "It's nearly midnight. That gives us less than 24 hours to find the journal and prepare a counter-ritual." In the darkness outside their window, patients and staff throughout the asylum suddenly turned toward the east wing in perfect unison, their eyes reflecting the same cold light that had illuminated Blackwater's laboratory. "Tomorrow, the true haunting," would begin. Dawn broke over Blackwater Asylum with sickly yellow light that did nothing to dispel the shadows. Throughout the night, patients had screamed in unison at precise 30-minute intervals. Staff reported seeing Dr. Blackwater walking the halls, examining patients with clinical detachment before vanishing. The entire building thrummed with malevolent anticipation. In their command center, Ed and Lorraine huddled with Stuart and Hannah, formulating a plan. Maps of the asylum spread across the table alongside Blackwater's research journals and occult reference books from the Warrens' personal collection. The binding ritual used blood magic, Ed explained, pointing to passages from Blackwater's notes. He used the life essence of his subjects to anchor his consciousness to the physical heart. Can it be reversed? Stuart asked. Every binding has an unbinding, Lorraine said. But we need the original ritual to understand how he structured the connections. Stuart spread out blueprints of the director's residence. The house has 3 floors, plus an attic. If Blackwater kept a personal journal, it would likely be in his study on the 2nd floor. Eastern exposure, as Hannah mentioned. We need to move quickly, Ed urged. As midnight approaches, his power will increase. Better to find the journal and prepare while we still have daylight. Hannah, who had been silently drawing in the corner, suddenly spoke. He knows what you're planning. Her hand moved mechanically across the paper, sketching the director's residence with a dark figure watching from an upstairs window. He's waiting for you there. Then we don't go alone, Ed decided. Stuart, find Jenkins. We need someone who knows the asylum's history. As Stuart left, Lorraine sat beside Hannah. You've been communicating with him for years. How has he sustained himself between cycles? The patients, Hannah replied softly. He feeds on their mental energy, their emotions. Fear is potent, but pain provides the most sustenance. She hesitated. And sometimes, when a suitable mind appears, he practices partial integration. Never enough to fully manifest, just enough to maintain his presence. The suicides, Lorraine realized, they weren't killing themselves, they were fighting his possession. Yes, when the integration fails, death is preferable. Hannah's eyes held the haunted knowledge of someone who had glimpsed such horrors directly. He showed me. It's like being buried alive in your own mind, feeling your thoughts gradually replaced until nothing of you remains. Ed returned with their equipment, holy water, crucifixes, ceremonial daggers, and a worn journal of counter-rituals compiled from previous cases. Binding rituals follow predictable patterns, he explained. Blood ties the spirit to an anchor object. Sacred geometry creates the energetic framework. Incantations establish the transfer protocol. We need to disrupt all 3 elements to break his hold on this plane. But the heart is protected, Lorraine reminded him. I felt the barriers when I stood on that platform, which is why we need his original ritual, Ed said, to understand the specific protections he created. Stuart returned with Jenkins, who looked terrified but resolute. My grandfather worked here during Blackwater's time, the orderly explained. Told me stories about the director's house, hidden passages, sealed rooms. Said Blackwater was paranoid about his research being stolen. What else did your grandfather tell you? Ed asked. That on the day Blackwater died, the sky turned red over the asylum. That they found the bodies of his assistants without a mark on them, their eyes burned white. That the east wing wasn't damaged by fire, it was sealed because the walls themselves seemed alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. Hannah doubled over suddenly, gasping in pain. When she straightened, her eyes had changed, the irises expanded until barely any white remained. He's getting stronger, she whispered, her voice layered with a second, deeper tone. The anniversary approaches. The veil thins. He's calling his subjects to him. Throughout the asylum, patients began to chant in unison. Their voices are dissonant. Chorus, prepare the vessels, complete the work. The doctor comes tonight. We need to move now, Ed urged. If we wait until nightfall, the entire asylum will be against us. As they gathered supplies, Dr. Stewart pulled Lorraine aside. There's something else you should know, he said quietly. Something I've realized about Blackwater's work. What is it? His early procedures before the ethical violations actually helped people. Patients with severe dissociative disorders, schizophrenia, even catalepsy, he could reach them when other doctors couldn't. Stewart looked conflicted. If we destroy everything, we lose potentially groundbreaking treatments for conditions we still can't effectively address today. At what cost? Lorraine challenged. Human experimentation, soul extraction. No, of course not. Stewart shook his head. But is there no middle ground? Must we destroy knowledge that could help thousands because its discoverer was a monster? You still don't understand what we're facing, Lorraine said. Blackwater wasn't searching for treatments. He was perfecting a method of immortality through possession. Any benefits to patients were incidental, useful only to justify his continued research. Before Stewart could respond, the lights flickered throughout the asylum. From somewhere deep in the east wing came a sound like metal striking metal, rhythmic. Deliberate, the sound of surgical instruments being arranged. He's starting early, Hannah whispered, clutching her temples. I can feel him preparing. As if to confirm her words, a female patient suddenly appeared in their doorway, eyes vacant. Movements jerky like a marionette. Blood trickled from her nose and ears as she spoke in Blackwater's precise diction. I've been watching your preparations. With interest, Mrs. Warren. A commendable, if futile, effort. The patient's head tilted at an unnatural angle. Perhaps a demonstration of what awaits is in order. The patient's skin began to split along invisible surgical lines, precise incisions, that formed in perfect patterns across her face and arms. No blood flowed from the wounds. Instead, a luminous blue energy pulsed beneath, visible through the separating flesh. The patient showed no pain, only a blank expression as her body was literally dissected while standing. The physical form is merely housing, Blackwater's voice continued as the patient's chest cavity opened, revealing glowing organs that moved with unnatural rhythm. The consciousness within that is the prize. Your grandmother understood this when I began working with her. Such a promising subject before her unfortunate departure. Ed lunged forward to help the patient, but an invisible barrier repelled him. With a final, horrible smile, the patient collapsed, her body reassembling itself as she fell unconscious to the floor. A crude demonstration with an inadequate vessel, Blackwater's voice echoed through the room, now disembodied. With you, Lorraine, the procedure will achieve perfection. Jenkins crossed himself, face pale with horror. Sweet Mary, what have you people awakened? Something that should have remained dormant, Ed said grimly, checking the unconscious patient's pulse. She's alive, but her mind is gone, Hannah finished. He consumed it during the demonstration, used her consciousness as fuel. Stewart stared at the patient, scientific detachment crumbling in the face of undeniable horror. I was wrong, he whispered, so terribly wrong. This isn't research, it's abomination. Now do you understand what we're facing? Lorraine asked. Stewart nodded, resolve hardening his features. I'll take full responsibility for my role in this. But first, Let's end what my grandfather helped create. The director's residence stood apart from the main asylum, a Victorian mansion whose elegance had faded under decades of neglect. Blackwater had lived here alone, refusing staff except for a single housekeeper who disappeared shortly before his death. The stories say he conducted private research here, Jenkins muttered as they approached. The front entrance. Experiments too unspeakable even for the asylum records. Stuart unlocked the massive front door, which swung open with surprising ease despite years of disuse. Like the laboratory in the basement, the interior showed few signs of age, as if time moved differently within these walls. The sky darkened prematurely as they entered, clouds gathering with unnatural speed above the asylum grounds. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no weather system had been forecast. The study is on the second floor, Stuart said. East wing, overlooking the cemetery. They moved cautiously through the house, footsteps echoing on marble floors. The interior was opulent but clinical, more laboratory than home. Glass display cases contained medical specimens and antiquated surgical tools. Bookshelves overflowed with medical texts in multiple languages alongside grimoires and occult manuscripts that seemed out of place in a doctor's collection. At the foot of the grand staircase, Hannah froze. "He's here," she whispered, watching us. The second floor corridor stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors. Stuart led them toward the east wing, where a set of double doors marked Blackwater's private study. Unlike the front entrance, these doors resisted stuck fast, despite Stuart's key turning in the lock. "He's blocking us," Lorraine said, placing her palm against the wood. She closed her eyes, extending her psychic senses through the barrier. "There's something on the other side, something he doesn't want us to find." Ed tried forcing the doors, but they remained sealed as if welded shut. Hannah stepped forward, producing a small scalpel stolen from the infirmary. Before anyone could stop her, she drew the blade across her palm, pressing the bleeding wound against the door. "Blood calls to blood," she said, echoing Blackwater's words. "You wanted vessels. Here's one offering access." The doors shuddered, then swung open with a sound like tearing flesh. Beyond lay Blackwater's study, immaculately preserved, as if he had stepped out moments ago rather than a century past. "We don't have much time," Stuart warned, checking his watch. "It's barely afternoon, but it looks like night is already falling." Sequence. His mother's birth date. They searched, methodically checking bookshelves, desk drawers, hidden panels behind paintings. Jenkins discovered a gap in the wood paneling, concealing a small safe with the now familiar circular symbol engraved on its door. "We need a combination," Stuart said, examining the dial. Hannah's eyes unfocused, head tilting as if listening to a distant voice. "He's trying to hide it from me, but I can see numbers." "A witch," is Ed pressed. June 18th, 1845. Hannah translated it to numbers. June 18th, 45. Stuart turned the dial carefully. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing a single leather-bound journal, smaller and more personal than Blackwater's research tomes. Inked on its cover was a simple title, "The Great Work." As Stuart reached for it, a violent tremor shook the house. The windows shattered inward, showering them with glass as the unnatural storm outside intensified. Wind howled through the broken panes, carrying a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Enough. The journal flew from the safe, hovering in the air before them. Its pages riffled, as if read by invisible hands. "This knowledge is not for you," Blackwater's voice thundered. The work continues tonight. The vessel is prepared. Nothing will prevent completion. Hannah, blood still flowing from her self-inflicted wound, suddenly spoke in a voice caught between her own and something older, deeper. You can't keep all your secrets, Doctor. Not from those who've seen inside your mind. She raised her bloodied hand, and, remarkably, the journal halted its escape. For a suspended moment, a battle of wills played out in the room, Hannah's eyes locked on the hovering book, blood dripping from her fingers. With a final, desperate gesture, Hannah sent the journal flying toward Ed, who caught it against his chest. The moment it left Blackwater's telekinetic grasp, a furious roar shook the foundation of the house. Cracks spread across the ceiling, and walls with alarming speed. "Run!" Stewart shouted, already pulling Jenkins toward the door. They fled through collapsing corridors as the director's residence began imploding. The grand staircase splintered as they descended, barely supporting their weight. They burst through the front door seconds before the entire structure collapsed inward, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble. A crack of lightning struck the main electrical transformer. The entire facility plunged into darkness as thunder rumbled across the sky. Rain began to fall thick, heavy drops that turned the access road into a muddy river and flooded the lower grounds. "No one's getting in or out," Jenkins said, watching the road disappear beneath the rising water. "We're locked in with whatever he's becoming." Inside the main entrance, they found chaos. Staff huddled in groups, using flashlights and candles for illumination. Patients had become unnaturally quiet, sitting motionless in day rooms and corridors. The backup systems are failing too, Stewart realized. He's isolating the building. Nurse Collins approached from the darkened corridor, her usual stern demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "What's happening?" Half the staff have simply walked out of their wards and into the East Wing. "The patients won't respond to any stimuli." "He's gathering his army," Hannah said quietly. "Every mind he can control becomes another soldier against us." They retreated to Stewart's office, barricading the door before Ed carefully opened Blackwater's personal journal. The pages revealed the full extent of his obsession. Detailed notes on his quest to achieve immortality through consciousness transfer. "Here's the ritual," Ed said, finding pages marked with the familiar circular symbol. October 1925. He'd perfected the method for consciousness extraction, but needed a way to preserve his own mind after death. The ritual was complex, a fusion of surgical procedure and ceremonial magic. Blackwater had removed his own heart, while still alive, preserving it through a combination of chemical solutions and blood magic. The blood came from 7 psychically sensitive patients, creating layers of protection around the organ. Lorraine read over Ed's shoulder. "The unbinding ritual requires the blood of someone from his own bloodline, combined with the blood of his intended vessel, applied directly to the heart while reciting the reversal incantation." "Blood of his bloodline," Stewart frowned. "How would we possibly—" "Hannah," Lorraine interrupted, turning to the young woman. "That's why you could resist him better than the others. Why you could see his memories. You're related to him, aren't you?" Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "My great-grandfather. My family changed our name after the scandal, moved away. But when my abilities started manifesting as a teenager, they sent me here. He found me, immediately recognized his own blood. And I'm the intended vessel," Lorraine said. "Our blood combined with the unbinding incantation could destroy his anchor. But we'd need to reach the heart," Ed reminded them. "And he'll throw everything he has at us to prevent that." Outside the barricaded door, they heard footsteps. dozens of them, moving in perfect unison through the darkened corridors. The possessed staff and patients had begun their patrol, seeking the small group of resistors. "We have until midnight," Lorraine said. "That's when he'll attempt the full integration. We need to reach the laboratory before then." Stuart looked at his watch in the flashlight beam. 7 hours to midnight. How do we get past an entire asylum of possessed people? "There's another way in," Hannah said suddenly. "A maintenance tunnel from the main building's subbasement. Blackwater used it to transport subjects secretly." Ed nodded grimly. "Then that's our path. We gather what we need and make our move at nightfall." A sudden silence fell outside the door. The footsteps ceased simultaneously. Through the barricade, they heard a single set of approaching footsteps, measured and deliberate. Dr. Stewart called a voice they recognized as Dr. Harrison's, though layered with Blackwater's cultured tones. "A word with you, colleague two." "Colleague, your grandfather understood the importance of my work," Blackwater's voice continued through Dr. Harrison. "He preserved my research when others would have destroyed it. Would you undo his legacy?" Stewart remained silent, though his expression revealed the words had struck their target. "Consider the greater good," the voice persisted. "Help me complete my work. One vessel, just one, in exchange for treatments that could help thousands." "One vessel," Lorraine challenged loudly. "You mean one stolen life, one consciousness erased? Mrs. Warren, so righteous." A chuckle emanated through the door. "Did it ever occur to you that your gift exists because of my work? The bloodlines I cultivated. You owe your very identity to me." "We owe you nothing," Ed shouted back, "except an end to your torment of innocent people." A scream of rage tore through the door as something massive slammed against it repeatedly. The barricade shuddered. "We need to move," Ed urged, gathering their supplies. "Now." Stewart pressed against a wooden panel behind his desk, revealing a narrow maintenance passage. "This connects to the central utility tunnels. If we can reach the subbasement, we might access the east wing from below." As they slipped into the passage, the office door finally splintered. Through the gap, they glimpsed Dr. Harrison, his body grotesquely manipulated, limbs bending at impossible angles, face contorted in rage. "You cannot escape," the voice roared. "The vessel will fulfill her purpose." Jenkins sealed the passage behind them, plunging them into darkness broken only by their flashlight beams. The narrow corridor forced them to move single file through the bowels of the asylum, a claustrophobic journey accompanied by distant sounds of pursuit. "The main junction should be ahead," Stewart whispered. "From there, we can access the subbasement." The utility tunnels widened into a central hub where pipes and electrical conduits converged. Hannah suddenly clutched her head, gasping in pain. "He's redirecting them," she whispered, "sending his puppets to cut us off at the subbasement entrance." Stewart pointed to a heavy iron door across the junction. "That's our only way down now." As Ed and Jenkins struggled to open the rusted door, Lorraine felt a familiar pressure building in her skull, Blackwater attempting to breach her mental defenses. The surgical markings on her skin began to glow faintly, burning like brands. "He's trying to locate us through me," she warned. Hannah took Lorraine's hands. "Focus on me. Our combined resistance is stronger than his intrusion." Together, they created a psychic barrier that temporarily blocked Blackwater's probing. The iron door finally yielded with a tortured groan of metal. Beyond lay a steep staircase descending into absolute darkness. The first possessed staff members appeared. At the tunnel entrances behind them, moving with jerky, uncoordinated motions. Ed and Jenkins faced the approaching horde as Stuart, Lorraine, and Hannah descended. The heavy iron panel slammed shut seconds before bodies crashed against it. "That won't hold them long," Jenkins warned as they hurried down the stairs. The subbasement had never been fully mapped, a labyrinth of storage rooms and forgotten patient cells. Their flashlights revealed walls of rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture, and corridors that seemed to shift direction when viewed too long. "We need to find the access tunnel to the east wing," Stuart said, consulting a hand-drawn map. "It should be along the eastern wall." "Something's wrong," Lorraine said, stopping suddenly. "The air feels different." Ed shined his light ahead, revealing a corridor that seemed to ripple like heat waves, distorting their perception of distance. "The veil is thinning," Hannah explained. "The boundary between worlds grows permeable near his power center." Stuart studied his map. No other way around. All paths to the east wing pass through this section. Lorraine stepped forward cautiously. As her hand touched the distortion, ripples spread outward. Through the fluctuating barrier, she glimpsed another version of the corridor, one where the stones were clean and new, where electric lights illuminated attendants in antique uniforms. "It's like a window into the past," she whispered. "The asylum, as it was during Blackwater's time." One by one, they passed through the rippling barrier. The transition felt like walking through electrified cobwebs. On the other side, they found themselves in the same corridor, yet transformed. The aged subbasement had been replaced by its 1920s incarnation, clinically clean, brightly lit, actively used. The sound of approaching footsteps sent them pressing against the wall. A doctor in period attire walked past, reviewing a patient chart, showing no awareness of their presence. "We're observers in his memory," Hannah explained, "unless he specifically focuses on us." They followed Stuart's map through the transformed subbasement, navigating corridors now bustling with activity from nearly a century past. All proceeded with their duties, unaware of the intruders from the future. Stuart pointed to a metal door marked East Wing Supplies. That should be the access point. As they approached, an unsettling change rippled through the memory space. The medical staff collectively paused, heads turning in perfect unison toward the intruders. Their eyes, previously unseeing, now fixed directly on the group with cold recognition. "He's found us," Hannah warned as the memory puppets began advancing from all directions. Ed reached the supply door first, yanking it open to reveal a vertical shaft with metal rungs embedded in the wall. Up, everyone up now. One by one they climbed, pursued by the grasping hands of Blackwater's memory constructs. Jenkins went last, kicking away reaching arms before pulling the door shut. The shaft extended 20 feet before ending at another metal door. Ed forced it open and pulled himself up into Blackwater's laboratory. The hidden sanctum was fully illuminated despite the power outage. Surgical equipment gleamed under bright lights. Preservation fluid in specimen jars bubbled with renewed vigor. At the center, the heart in its glass case pulsed with visible strength, each beat sending ripples of energy throughout the room. "We made it," Stuart whispered as the others emerged from the shaft. "But we're not alone," Lorraine said, pointing to a figure standing beside the heart. Hannah stepped forward, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I had no choice." "Hannah," Lorraine reached toward her. "What are you doing?" "What she must," said Blackwater's voice, now emanating directly from the pulsing heart. "Blood calls to blood, after all." Hannah turned to them fully. and they saw the surgical markings now covering her skin, identical to those on Lorraine's body, but glowing more intensely. "I wanted to help you," Hannah said, voice breaking. "But he's stronger inside my mind. He's always been there since I arrived. My own great-grandfather." "Hannah, fight him," Ed urged. "You've resisted him before." "I can't anymore," she whispered. "Not here, not so close to the source. I'm sorry." With a gesture from Hannah, invisible force slammed Ed and Jenkins against the wall, pinning them there. Stuart was thrown across the room, crashing into a cabinet of specimens. Only Lorraine remained free, standing halfway between Hannah and the others. "Now, Mrs. Warren," Blackwater's voice purred from the heart. "The final choice is yours. Join me willingly, and your friends will be spared. Resist, and witness their consciousness extracted to fuel my return." Hannah's eyes pleaded with Lorraine, even as her body betrayed her will. "He's offering you something," she managed to say. "Something you don't know about yet." "What is he offering?" Lorraine asked. Hannah struggled to speak through Blackwater's control. "Your grandmother, she's still here. He preserved her consciousness. She's trapped with the others. He says you can save her." The heart pulsed more rapidly, the glass case vibrating with power. "Midnight approaches, Mrs. Warren. The veil thins. Choose now, join your bloodline's legacy, or watch your husband die screaming. Your grandfather understood the importance of my work." Blackwater's voice continued through Dr. Harrison. "He preserved my research when others would have destroyed it. Would you undo his legacy?" Stuart remained silent, though his expression revealed the words had struck their target. "Consider the greater good," the voice persisted. "Help me complete my work. One vessel, just one, in exchange for treatments that could help thousands." "One vessel?" Lorraine challenged loudly. "You mean one stolen life? One consciousness erased? Mrs. Warren, so righteous." A chuckle emanated through the door. "Did it ever occur to you that your gift exists because of my work? The bloodlines I cultivated, you owe your very identity to me." "We owe you nothing," Ed shouted back, "except an end to your torment of innocent people." A scream of rage tore through the door as something massive slammed against it repeatedly. The barricade shuddered. "We need to move," Ed urged, gathering their supplies now. Stuart pressed against a wooden panel behind his desk, revealing a narrow maintenance passage. "This connects to the central utility tunnels. If we can reach the subbasement, we might access the east wing from below." As they slipped into the passage, the office door finally splintered. Through the gap, they glimpsed Dr. Harrison, his body, grotesquely manipulated, limbs bending at impossible angles, face contorted in rage. "You cannot escape," the voice roared. "The vessel will fulfill her purpose." Jenkins sealed the passage behind them, plunging them into darkness, broken only by their flashlight beams. The narrow corridor forced them to move single file through the bowels of the asylum, a claustrophobic journey accompanied by distant sounds of pursuit. "The main junction should be ahead," Stuart whispered. "From there, we can access the subbasement." The utility tunnels widened into a central hub where pipes and electrical conduits converged. Hannah suddenly clutched her head, gasping in pain. "He's redirecting them," she whispered, "sending his puppets to cut us off at the subbasement entrance." Stuart pointed to a heavy iron door across the junction. "That's our only way down now." As Ed and Jenkins struggled to open the rusted door, Lorraine felt a familiar pressure building in her skull, Blackwater attempting to breach her mental defenses. The surgical markings on her skin began to glow faintly, burning like brands. "He's trying to locate us through me," she warned. Hannah took Lorraine's hands. Focus on me. Our combined resistance is stronger than his intrusion. Together, they created a psychic barrier that temporarily blocked Blackwater's probing. The iron door finally yielded with a tortured groan of metal. Beyond lay a steep staircase descending into absolute darkness. The first possessed staff members appeared at the tunnel entrances behind them, moving with jerky, uncoordinated motions. Ed and Jenkins faced the approaching horde as Stuart, Lorraine, and Hannah descended. The heavy iron panels slammed shut, seconds before bodies crashed against it. That won't hold them long, Jenkins warned as they hurried down the stairs. The subbasement had never been fully mapped, a labyrinth of storage rooms and forgotten patient cells. Their flashlights revealed walls of rough-hewn stone slick with moisture and corridors that seemed to shift direction when viewed too long. We need to find the access tunnel to the east wing, Stuart said, consulting a hand-drawn map. It should be along the eastern wall. Something's wrong, Lorraine said, stopping suddenly. The air feels different. Ed shined his light ahead, revealing a corridor that seemed to ripple like heat waves, distorting their perception of distance. The veil is thinning, Hannah explained. The boundary between worlds grows permeable near his power center. Stuart studied his map. No other way around. All paths to the east wing pass through this section. Lorraine stepped forward cautiously. As her hand touched the distortion, ripples spread outward. Through the fluctuating barrier, she glimpsed another version of the corridor, one where the stones were clean and new, where electric lights illuminated attendants in antique uniforms. It's like a window into the past, she whispered. The asylum as it was during Blackwater's time. One by one, they passed through the rippling barrier. The transition felt like walking through electrified cobwebs. On the other side, they found themselves in the same corridor, yet transformed. The aged subbasement had been replaced by its 1920s incarnation, clinically clean, brightly lit, actively used. The sound of approaching footsteps sent them pressing against the wall. A doctor in period attire walked past, reviewing a patient chart, showing no awareness of their presence. We're observers in his memory, Hannah explained, unless he specifically focuses on us. They followed Stuart's map through the transformed subbasement, navigating corridors now bustling with activity from nearly a century past. All proceeded with their duties, unaware of the intruders from the future. Stuart pointed to a metal door marked East Wing Supplies. That should be the access point. As they approached, an unsettling change rippled through the memory space. The medical staff collectively paused, heads turning in perfect unison toward the intruders. Their eyes, previously unseeing, now fixed directly on the group with cold recognition. He's found us, Hannah warned, as the memory puppets began advancing from all directions. Ed reached the supply door first, yanking it open to reveal a vertical shaft with metal rungs embedded in the wall. Up, everyone up now. One by one they climbed, pursued by the grasping hands of Blackwater's memory constructs. Jenkins went last, kicking away reaching arms before pulling the door shut. The shaft extended 20 feet before ending at another metal door. Ed forced it open and pulled himself up into Blackwater's laboratory. The hidden sanctum was fully illuminated despite the power outage. Surgical equipment gleamed under bright lights. Preservation fluid in specimen jars bubbled with renewed vigor. At the center, the heart in its glass case pulsed with visible strength, each beat sending ripples of energy throughout the room. "We made it," Stuart whispered as the others emerged from the shaft. "But we're not alone," Lorraine said, pointing to a figure standing beside the heart. Hannah stepped forward, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I had no choice, Hannah." Lorraine reached toward her. "What are you doing?" "What she must," said Blackwater's voice, now emanating directly from the pulsing heart. "Blood calls to blood, after all." Hannah turned to them fully, and they saw the surgical markings now covering her skin, identical to those on Lorraine's body, but glowing more intensely. "I wanted to help you," Hannah said, voice breaking. "But he's stronger inside my mind. He's always been there since I arrived. My own great-grandfather." "Hannah, fight him," Ed urged. "You've resisted him before." "I can't anymore," she whispered. "Not here, not so close to the source. I'm sorry." With a gesture from Hannah, invisible force slammed Ed and Jenkins against the wall, pinning them there. Stuart was thrown across the room, crashing into a cabinet of specimens. Only Lorraine remained free, standing halfway between Hannah and the others. "Now, Mrs. Warren," Blackwater's voice purred from the heart. "The final choice is yours. Join me willingly, and your friends will be spared. Resist, and witness their consciousness extracted to fuel my return." Hannah's eyes pleaded with Lorraine even as her body betrayed her will. "He's offering you something," she managed to say. "Something you don't know about yet." "What is he offering?" Lorraine asked. Hannah struggled to speak through black. "Control. Your grandmother, she's still here. He preserved her consciousness. She's trapped with the others. He says you can save her." The heart pulsed more rapidly, the glass case vibrating with power. "Midnight approaches, Mrs. Warren." The VEIL thins. "Choose now, join your bloodline's legacy, or watch your husband die screaming." The laboratory air hummed with gathering power. Midnight approached, the anniversary of Blackwater's death, when the veil between worlds would be thinnest. The heart in its glass case pulsed with increasing intensity, each beat sending visible waves of energy rippling outward. "My grandmother," Lorraine whispered, staring at Hannah. "She's still conscious. After all these years." "Preserved," Hannah confirmed, her voice strained as she fought Blackwater's control. "Like the others, not dead, not alive. Suspended between." Her hands trembled with the effort of resistance. "He keeps them as batteries. Their consciousness generates energy he can harvest." Blackwater's voice emanated from the heart, cultured and persuasive. "I offer you reunion, Mrs. Warren. Your grandmother has waited nearly a century for someone to reach her. Through our integration, you could communicate with her again, perhaps even free her." Ed struggled against the invisible force pinning him to the wall. "Don't listen to him, Lorraine. It's manipulation, not truth." "Is it?" The heart pulsed brighter. "Perhaps your husband would like a demonstration." The surgical instruments on a nearby table rose into the air, hovering before Ed's face. A scalpel pressed against his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. "Stop," Lorraine cried. The instruments paused, but remained suspended. Blackwater chuckled, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls. "I've waited too long for another vessel of your caliber. Mrs. Warren, your grandmother was promising, but you've developed abilities beyond my expectations." The perfect resonance chamber. Stuart, dazed but conscious across the room, caught Lorraine's eye. His hands slowly moved toward his pocket where they had placed a vial from their supplies. Holy water mixed with salt and blessed soil from 7 churches. Prepared according to the counter-ritual instructions in Ed's journal. "What exactly are you offering?" Lorraine asked. deliberately drawing Blackwater's attention away from Stuart. Integration means possession. My consciousness erased by yours. Not erased. Elevated. The temperature in the laboratory dropped sharply. Our minds would merge, your abilities enhanced by my knowledge, my consciousness sustained by your vitality. Together, we could bridge the final gap between life and death. And what of the others you've consumed? The staff who died every 7 years, the patients whose minds you hollowed out for practice. Necessary sacrifices for the advancement of knowledge. Blackwater's voice hardened. You stand at the threshold of discovery that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of consciousness. Would you reject this gift out of simple moral squeamishness? Hannah groaned, her resistance clearly causing her physical pain. Blood trickled from her nose as she fought Blackwater's control. The journal, she managed to say, eyes flicking toward Ed. The reversal you need, both our blood. Blackwater's fury manifested as a psychic shockwave that slammed through the room, sending equipment crashing to the floor. Silence, child. You forget your place in this work. The distraction weakened his hold momentarily. Ed dropped to the floor as the force restraining him faltered. Jenkins fell beside him, immediately crawling toward the central platform where the unbinding ritual would need to be performed. No, Blackwater's rage filled the room. The glass containers lining the walls shattered simultaneously, releasing preserved specimens and noxious chemicals that splashed across the floor. You will not undo a century of work. The physical reality of the laboratory began to warp as Blackwater summoned his full power. The floor beneath them rippled like liquid, revealing glimpses of bottomless darkness where reaching hands clawed upward the trapped consciousness of his previous victims. The ceiling dissolved into a nightmarish vision of suspended bodies in various states of dissection, all perfectly preserved and mounted with the clinical precision of medical exhibits. The veiled tears, Hannah gasped, falling to her knees as blood now streamed from her eyes as well as her nose. He's merging the planes, physical and spiritual. Ed reached into his pocket for Blackwater's journal, now crumpled but intact. The unbinding ritual, he shouted to Lorraine. We need to reach the heart. Stuart seized his opportunity. With Blackwater's attention divided, he lunged across the room, tossing the vial of holy water mixture to Lorraine. She caught it one-handed. Already moving toward the central platform, Hannah screamed, a sound of pure agony as Blackwater punished her resistance. Her body contorted unnaturally, limbs bending at impossible angles. Yet somehow, through sheer will, she stretched a bloody hand toward Lorraine. Take it, she rasped. My blood with yours on the heart. The laboratory doors burst open as possessed army arrived, staff and patients moving in perfect unison, faces blank, eyes reflecting the same cold light that pulsed from the heart. They formed a ring around the room, blocking any escape. Your choice expires at midnight, Mrs. Warren, Blackwater announced as the heart's pulse synchronized with a clock on the wall, its hands approaching 12. Join me willingly, or I take what I need by force. In that moment, something shifted. Within Lorraine, a clarity that cut through fear and doubt. Her grandmother had resisted Blackwater decades ago, escaping his control despite her captivity. Now her blood, carried in Lorraine's veins, would finish what she started. You're right about one thing, Doctor, Lorraine said, stepping onto the central platform. Blood does call to blood. The circular symbol beneath her feet illuminated, responding to her presence. The surgical markings on her skin glowed in perfect resonance with the pattern. Blackwater mistook her movement for acquiescence, the heart pulsing triumphantly. "A wise decision," he purred. "The integration will be less traumatic this way." "I wasn't talking about your blood," Lorraine replied, uncorking the vial. With sudden understanding, Blackwater howled in rage. The heart case began to vibrate violently as he attempted to knock the vial from her hand. The possessed army surged forward, but Ed and Jenkins formed a human barrier around the platform, fighting them back with desperate strength. Stuart shouted across the chaos, reading the reversal incantation from the journal as Ed had instructed. "By earth and air, by water and fire, we break the bonds of unnatural desire. What death has claimed must not return. What was preserved shall now be burned." Hannah, still fighting Blackwater's control, dragged herself onto the platform beside Lorraine. Her nose, eyes, and ears now streamed blood as Blackwater's rage tore through her consciousness. Together, she gasped, extending her bloody hand. Lorraine clasped it with her own, slicing her palm on the scalpel Ed had tossed to her. Their blood mingled the blood of Blackwater's intended vessel and the blood of his own lineage. She poured the holy water mixture into their joined hands, completing the components needed for the unbinding. "From blood it came, to blood returns," Lorraine recited, continuing the incantation as Stuart struggled to maintain his reading while fending off the possessed. The anchor breaks, the spirit burns. With a single, powerful movement, Lorraine slammed their joined hands against the glass case containing the heart. The barrier that had protected it for nearly a century shattered under the combined assault of blood, holy water, and incantation. The exposed heart convulsed violently as their blood touched its surface. A scream of rage and disbelief tore through the laboratory, no longer coming from the heart, but from the very air around them as Blackwater's spirit was forcibly pulled from its anchor. "You cannot destroy me," his voice thundered. "I am beyond death. No one is beyond death, Doctor," Lorraine replied calmly. "Not even you." The walls of reality between worlds, already thinned by Blackwater's power, tore open completely. Through the rupture, Lorraine glimpsed what lay beyond countless souls trapped in Blackwater's grip, her grandmother among them, reaching toward the light now breaking through their prison as midnight struck. The heart burst into blue flame that consumed it instantly, leaving nothing but ash. A shock wave of released energy exploded outward from the platform, knocking everyone to the floor as Blackwater's final scream faded into silence. The horror show ceiling dissolved. The bottomless pits in the floor sealed themselves. The possessed staff and patients collapsed like marionettes with cut strings, unconscious but alive. In the sudden, deafening silence, Hannah smiled weakly at Lorraine through blood-streaked tears. "They're free," she whispered. "All of them, free." Dawn broke over Blackwater Asylum with gentle clarity that seemed impossible after the previous night's horrors. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been shrouded in unnatural darkness for days. The storm had vanished, leaving behind a pristine autumn morning with no evidence of the flooding or destruction. Emergency services had finally reached the asylum after communications were mysteriously restored around 12:01 a.m. They found confused staff members who remembered nothing after the power outage, and patients who had fallen into deep, peaceful sleep regardless of their previous conditions. In Stuart's office, the Warrens sat with the asylum director and Jenkins, attempting to process what they had experienced. Hannah lay in the infirmary, exhausted but stable, her connection to Blackwater finally severed. "The state inspectors will be here by noon," Stuart said, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "How exactly do I explain what happened here?" "You don't," Ed replied, organizing their equipment for departure. Power outage during the storm. Mass hysteria triggered by the emergency conditions. Patients responding to the stress of disrupted routines. And the director's residence. The collapsed building will be rather difficult to explain away. Old structure, poor maintenance, storm damage, Lorraine suggested. The truth would only damage the patient's recovery and your career. Stuart nodded slowly, the weight of his responsibility settling back onto shoulders that seemed to have aged years overnight. I enabled this, he said quietly. My grandfather preserved Blackwater's research, and I reopened the East Wing, thinking I could separate medical breakthroughs from their monstrous origins. You weren't entirely wrong, Lorraine said, surprising both men. Knowledge itself isn't evil. Blackwater's early work on consciousness did help people with dissociative disorders. His methods for reaching catatonic patients could still benefit psychiatric care. Ed looked at her questioningly. I felt them, Ed, she explained. When the veil tore open completely, not just the trapped souls, but the connections Blackwater had mapped between mind and spirit. There was genuine discovery there, buried beneath his obsession and cruelty. She turned to Stuart. The research journals, in your office, the early work. Before he began experimenting with consciousness, transfer those might still have value. You'd advocate preserving any of his research. After what we witnessed, Stuart asked incredulously. Not his methods, Lorraine clarified. Not the blood rituals or soul extraction, but his understanding of consciousness as existing beyond the physical brain that could help people if approached ethically. Ed considered his wife's words. Even darkness can teach us about light, he said, quoting something Lorraine had told him years ago. But the decision isn't ours. The laboratory should be sealed permanently. The rest is your responsibility, Dr. Stuart. Stuart looked out. The window at the asylum grounds, now peaceful in the morning light. I came here to rehabilitate this place's reputation, to help people while redeeming my family's connection to its darkest chapter. He sighed heavily. Perhaps there's still a way to do that by ensuring Blackwater's crimes never repeat, while preserving what genuine healing his early work might offer. Jenkins, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. What about the others? The patients and staff who were possessed? Will they remember? Most won't, Lorraine answered. Their consciousness was suppressed during the possession. They'll have gaps in their memory, nightmares perhaps, but the human mind protects itself from trauma it can't process. And the laboratory? Stuart asked. The heart is destroyed, but the space itself will never be completely clean, Lorraine admitted. Some impressions remain after events of this magnitude. The East Wing should stay sealed, not just locked, but properly sealed with both physical and spiritual barriers. I'll handle that personally, Stuart promised. No future director will make my mistake. As they prepared to leave, a nurse appeared at the door. Mrs. Warren, Hannah is asking for you. She's awake. They found Hannah sitting up in her bed, pale but lucid. The bloody tears had been washed away, leaving her looking younger, almost childlike in the hospital gown. You did it, she said when she saw Lorraine. You freed them, all of them. We freed them, Lorraine corrected, taking the girl's hand. Your resistance gave us the time we needed. Your blood completed the ritual. You fought your own bloodlines. Darkness, Hannah's eyes filled with tears, normal ones this time. I saw my great-grandfather's memories when the barrier broke. He wasn't always a monster. Before his obsession consumed him, He genuinely wanted to help people who couldn't be reached by conventional medicine. That doesn't excuse what he became, Ed said gently. No, Hannah agreed. But it helps me understand the legacy I carry. She looked at Lorraine. The same legacy you carry through your grandmother. What do you mean? Lorraine asked. Our abilities, yours and mine, they're not just genetic coincidence. They were cultivated intentionally across generations. Hannah's expression grew troubled. Blackwater experimented on his own family first, enhancing psychic sensitivity through specific stimuli and treatments. Those changes became hereditary. So my connection to the spirit world is partly natural, partly engineered, Hannah confirmed. But that doesn't diminish your gift, or how you've chosen to use it. She managed a small smile. Our ancestors' darkness doesn't have to define us. Before leaving, Lorraine walked alone through the now quiet corridors of the East Wing. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by the peculiar emptiness of abandoned places. Yet she could still sense the echoes of what had occurred, not Blackwater's malevolence, but the release of those he had imprisoned, the peaceful aftermath of long-awaited freedom. In the converted day room that had served as their command center, she found a single drawing left behind one of Hannah's sketches. But unlike the disturbing images of Blackwater and his surgical procedures, this showed something different. Ethereal figures ascending in spirals of light, faces peaceful, hands releasing their earthly tethers. Among them, Lorraine recognized one face older than in the photographs she'd seen, but unmistakably her grandmother. Hannah had captured the moment of release when the trapped souls had finally crossed over. At the bottom of the page, Hannah had written, "They wanted you to know they're at peace." Lorraine carefully folded the drawing and placed it in her pocket. As she turned to leave, she heard, or perhaps felt, a final whisper through the asylum's hallways, "Thank you." Outside, Ed waited beside their car. "Are you all right?" he asked as she emerged into the sunlight. "Yes," she said with quiet certainty. "They're gone, all of them. Blackwater included, and the asylum." Lorraine looked back at the imposing Gothic structure, its shadow now just an ordinary shadow in the morning light. It's just a building now. Whatever power it held is broken. Stuart approached as they prepared to depart. "The state investigators are satisfied with our explanation of a storm-induced power failure and structural damage to the old residence. No mention of anything supernatural." "Good," Ed nodded. "Better for everyone that way." "I wanted to give you this," Stuart said, handing Lorraine a small package wrapped in cloth. "Hannah asked me to pass it along." Inside was a small leather-bound journal, not Blackwater's personal grimoire, which had been destroyed during the ritual, but a newer notebook filled with Hannah's handwriting. Her observations about her own abilities, Stuart explained. "She thought it might help you understand yours better. She's decided to leave Blackwater, both the asylum and her family name. Starting fresh somewhere her legacy can't find her." "Will she be all right?" Lorraine asked. "I think so. Her abilities remain, but without Blackwater's influence, she can learn to use them on her own terms." Stuart extended his hand to Ed. "Thank you both for everything." As they drove away from Blackwater Asylum, Lorraine felt a weight lifting. Not just the immediate danger they had faced, but a deeper burden she hadn't recognized until now. In their own way, whatever Blackwater had done to her grandmother's bloodline, whatever enhancements he had engineered into her psychic sensitivity, her gift remained hers to use as she chose. "What are you thinking?" Ed asked, noticing her contemplative silence. That sometimes our greatest strengths come from darkest origins, she replied. But it's what we choose to do with them that matters. The asylum receded in the rearview mirror, peaceful at last in the autumn sunlight. The New England countryside rolled past their car windows, autumn foliage painting the landscape in fiery oranges and reds. Ed and Lorraine had driven for nearly 2 hours in comfortable silence, each processing the events at Blackwater ASI. We should add this case to the restricted files, Ed said finally, eyes steady on the road ahead. Not for public access, even for researchers. Lorraine nodded. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share widely. She fingered the small journal Hannah had given her, which rested on her lap. Though there are insights here that might help us with future cases. What kind of insights? About the nature of psychic sensitivity, how it manifests differently across bloodlines, how trauma can amplify or suppress natural abilities. She glanced at her husband. Hannah documented her experiences with remarkable clarity despite what she was going through. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees as they turned onto a less traveled road that would take them through a shortcut Ed preferred. Lorraine felt her eyelids growing heavy, the exhaustion of the past days finally catching up to her. Just as she was about to doze off, a familiar sensation prickled at the edge of her consciousness, the unmistakable presence of a spirit. Her eyes snapped open. "Ed," she said quietly, "we're not alone." Ed glanced in the rearview mirror. The back seat appeared empty, but after decades of working with Lorraine, he knew better than to doubt her sensitivity. "Blackwater?" he asked, tension creeping into his voice. "No." Lorraine turned slightly, focusing on the presence. "It's Hannah." A faint shimmer materialized in the back seat, gradually coalescing into a transparent image of Hannah, not as they had left her, dressed in a hospital gown, but as she might have been outside the asylum, wearing simple civilian clothes, hair loose around her shoulders, face peaceful. "She's not dead," Ed said with certainty. "We just left her at Blackwater." "It's not her physical form," Lorraine explained, studying the apparition. "It's a projection. She's reaching out psychically." Hannah's spirit form smiled sadly. "I couldn't let you leave without telling you," her voice whispered, more sensation than sound. He had other children, other bloodlines he experimented on. Lorraine felt a chill despite the car's heater. "What do you mean?" Blackwater wasn't just seeking individual vessels. He was cultivating entire families with enhanced sensitivity. "My line was just one branch. There were others. I saw it all when the veil tore open." Ed's hands tightened on the steering wheel. How many? 7 families, 7 bloodlines, each with different manifestations of psychic ability. The spirit's outline flickered like a candle flame. "You should know he's not the only one who sought to manipulate consciousness. There were others, colleagues, students, people who learned fragments of his methods." "Why are you telling us this now?" Lorraine asked. "Because you'll encounter them, the other bloodlines, the other researchers. Someday." Hannah's form began to fade. "I won't remember this conversation when I wake. The projection takes too much energy, but I needed to warn you." "Hannah, wait," Lorraine started, but the spirit form had already dissipated, leaving behind only a lingering chill in the air. Ed pulled the car to the side of the road, turning to face his wife. "What do we make of that?" Lorraine stared at the now empty back seat. "It means our work is far from over. Whatever Blackwater started has roots that spread wider than we imagined." They sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling over them like the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. "We'll face it together," Ed said finally. reaching for her hand. Whatever comes, whenever it comes. Lorraine nodded, drawing. Strength from his touch. Whatever darkness Blackwater created will bring light to it. That's what we do. As they continued their journey home, Lorraine opened Hannah's journal again, studying the detailed observations with new urgency. One passage caught her eye, a note about recurring dreams Hannah had experienced since childhood. I always see the same symbol, a circle divided by 7 lines, each ending in a different pattern. I've come to understand it represents us, the 7 bloodlines, each with our unique gift. We're connected somehow, though separated by generations and geography. Sometimes I feel them, the others. Like distant stars in a constellation, I can almost map miles behind them. Blackwater Asylum stood quiet against the darkening sky. In Dr. Stewart's office, the director reviewed patient files by lamplight, reorganizing the facility's approach to care in the wake of recent events. A single file lay open on his desk, a new admission from the previous week. A young man with remarkable sensitivity to others' emotional states. Stewart's pen hovered over a note in the margin. Patient exhibits characteristics similar to Warren. Case. After a moment's hesitation, Stewart closed the file and placed it in his desk drawer. Some patterns were better left unrecognized. Some connections better left unexplored. In the east wing, now properly sealed and locked, a single light flickered on in a window where no electricity flowed. Just for a moment there, then gone. As if something was simply checking that all was quiet. Waiting, patient, the darkness settled back into the abandoned corridors, content to bide its time. After all, there were other bloodlines, other vessels, other opportunities, and the veil between worlds would thin again. Blackwater Asylum closed in 1980. The building remains abandoned to this day. Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated over 10,000 cases in their lifetime. Their files on Blackwater remain sealed by request of the family.